The thundering hooves of horses kicked up clouds of dust as Katherine Langston struggled against the rope binding her wrists. Her heart pounded in her chest, fear coursing through her veins as three strangers dragged her through the dusty streets of Silver Creek, Colorado. It was 1875, and the West was still wild and untamed, much like the men who now treated her as nothing more than cargo to be delivered. "I've done nothing wrong," Katherine shouted, her voice cracking as she stumbled over a rock. Her once pristine blue dress was now torn and filthy, her auburn hair falling loose from its pins. "Shut your mouth, woman," growled the largest of the men, his face partially hidden beneath a grimy hat. "The Prescott boys paid good money to have you brought to them, and that's exactly what we're doing." Katherine's blood ran cold. The Prescott brothers were notorious in these parts cruel cattle barons who took what they wanted without concern for law or decency. She had rejected Samuel Prescott's advances at the town social last week, and now she was paying the price for her defiance. The men reached the edge of town, where fewer people would witness their mistreatment of a young woman. With callous indifference, the leader yanked hard on the rope, sending Katherine tumbling face first into the dirt road. "Let's rest a spell before we head to the Prescott ranch," he said to his companions. "The lady here needs to learn some manners before we deliver her." Katherine spat dirt from her mouth, tears stinging her eyes. At 22, she had come west to teach at the new schoolhouse, determined to build a life of independence far from her overbearing family in Boston. Now, all her dreams seemed to crumble like the dry earth beneath her. "Please," she begged, struggling to sit up in the dust. There must be some mistake. The crack of a whip silenced her, though it mercifully struck the ground beside her rather than her flesh. The warning was clear enough. "I believe the lady asked you to stop." The deep, steady voice cut through the afternoon air like a knife. Katherine turned her head to see a tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. A cowboy stood 20 paces away, his stance wide and confident, one hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. "This ain't your business, mister," said the leader of Katherine's captors. "Ride on if you know what's good for you." The cowboy took a step forward, and Katherine could now see him more clearly. Broad-shouldered and lean-hipped, he wore a dust-covered black hat and a faded blue shirt. His face was partially obscured by several days' worth of stubble, but his eyes were sharp and clear as they assessed the situation. "When I see three men roughing up a lady, I make it my business," he replied, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable note of steel. "Now I'm going to ask you once to untie her and leave her be." The three men exchanged glances, clearly calculating their odds. After a moment, the leader reached for his gun. What happened next occurred so quickly that Katherine could barely follow it. The cowboy's hand moved in a blur and his pistol barked twice. The leader's gun flew from his hand, and one of his companions let out a yell as a bullet grazed his arm. "Next one goes between somebody's eyes," the cowboy said quietly. "Your choice as to who goes first." The men backed away, cursing. "The Prescotts won't forget this," the leader spat as they mounted their horses, "and neither will we." "I'm counting on it," the cowboy replied, his gun still trained on them as they galloped away. When the dust settled, Katherine found herself alone with her rescuer. He holstered his weapon and approached her slowly, as one might approach a spooked horse. "Are you hurt, madam?" he asked, kneeling beside her in the dirt. Katherine shook her head, though every muscle in her body ached from the rough treatment. "No, I don't believe so." The cowboy produced a knife and carefully cut the ropes binding her wrists. His hands were calloused but gentle, and Katherine felt an unexpected flutter in her chest as his fingers briefly touched her skin. "My name's Frank Jameson," he said, removing his hat. Without its shadow, she could see his face clearly handsome in a weathered way, with kind eyes that belied his deadly proficiency with a gun. "Friends call me Frank. Katherine Langston," she replied, her voice steadier now. "I'm the new schoolteacher, or I was supposed to be." Frank helped her to her feet, supporting her elbow when she swayed slightly. "Those men, they work for the Prescotts?" "I believe so. I refused Samuel Prescott's advances last week." Katherine brushed futilely at the dirt covering her dress. I never imagined he would resort to kidnapping." Frank's jaw tightened. The Prescotts think they own this territory and everyone in it. He glanced down the road where the men had disappeared. "They'll be back, likely with reinforcements. It's not safe for you in town anymore." "But where can I go? I have no family here, no friends yet." The reality of her situation began to sink in, and Katherine felt panic rising in her throat. Frank seemed to consider for a moment before making a decision. "I have a small ranch about 10 miles from here. It's not much, but you'd be safe there until we figure out what to do about the Prescotts." Katherine hesitated. Go alone with a strange man to his isolated ranch. It went against everything she'd been taught about propriety. And yet, what choice did she have? "I promise you'll come to no harm," Frank added, seeming to read her thoughts. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Wilkins, lives there too. She's a proper old battle axe who'd tan my hide if I stepped out of line." That brought a small smile to Katherine's face. "Thank you, Mr. Jameson. I accept your offer." Frank whistled, and a magnificent chestnut horse trotted over from where it had been waiting in the shade of a cottonwood tree. He helped Katherine mount, then swung up behind her. "Hold on tight, Miss Langston," he said as he reached around her to take the reins. "We've got a ways to go, and we need to make good time before those fellows round up their courage again." As they rode away from Silver Creek, Katherine found herself acutely aware of the strong arms encircling her, the steady beat of Frank's heart against her back. She had come west seeking independence, but now found herself dependent on the kindness of a stranger, a cowboy who had lifted her from the dust and was carrying her toward an uncertain future. The ride to Frank's ranch took longer than expected. They stayed off the main trails, winding through stands of pine and along dry creek beds. Katherine's muscles protested the unfamiliar activity, but she remained silent, determined not to appear weak. "Not much farther now," Frank said as they crested a rise. The sun was setting, painting the sky in spectacular hues of orange and purple. Below them stretched a modest valley with a small log cabin nestled against the hills. A corral held several horses, and smoke rose from the cabin's chimney, promising warmth and comfort. "It's lovely," Katherine said sincerely. "It's not much compared to what you probably had back east," Frank replied, a note of self-consciousness in his voice. "I find it far more appealing than my father's stuffy Boston townhouse," she assured him. As they approached the cabin, the door swung open to reveal a stout woman with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun. She planted her hands on her hips, eyeing them suspiciously. "Francis Jameson, what trouble have you brought home this time?" she called out. Frank chuckled as he dismounted and helped Katherine down. "Mrs. Wilkins, this is Miss Katherine Langston, the new schoolteacher. She's had some difficulty with the Prescott boys and needs a safe place to stay for a while. Mrs. Wilkins's expression softened as she took in Katherine's disheveled appearance. "Those Prescotts are the devil's own spawn," she muttered. "Come in, child, let's get you cleaned up and fed." The interior of the cabin was simple but neat, with a large hearth dominating one wall. 2 doors led off from the main room, presumably to bedrooms. The furniture was sturdy and functional, with a few unexpected touches of refinement: a shelf of books, a framed landscape painting, a rocking chair with an intricately carved back. "You'll take my room, Mrs. Wilkins announced, leading Katherine to one of the doors. "I'll bunk with Francis's sister when she visits. She's away in Denver now." "I couldn't possibly displace you," Katherine protested. "Nonsense. The boy will sleep in the barn as he often does anyway, and I'll take the small room." "It's all settled." Her tone brooked no argument. After washing up and changing into a borrowed nightgown and robe, Katherine rejoined Frank and Mrs. Wilkins for a simple but satisfying meal of venison stew and cornbread. As they ate, she told them about her journey west and her hopes for teaching at the Silver Creek School. "The town council hired me based on my credentials from the Boston Ladies' Seminary," she explained, "but now I fear I may have to move on." "Not necessarily," Frank said, his expression thoughtful. "The Prescotts have influence, but they don't own everyone in Silver Creek. There are plenty of folks who'd stand with you against them. Including us," Mrs. Wilkins added firmly. Katherine felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the hearth fire. "You've already done so much for me, and we've only just met." "Out here, we look after our own," Frank said simply, "and Silver Creek needs a good teacher more than it needs another Prescott lackey." Later, as Katherine lay in Mrs. Wilkins's comfortable bed, she reflected on the day's events. She had come west seeking adventure and independence, but she hadn't expected quite so much excitement quite so soon. As she drifted off to sleep, her last thoughts were of Frank Jameson's steady hands and the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. The next morning, Katherine awoke to the smell of coffee and bacon. She dressed quickly in a simple blue dress that Mrs. Wilkins had altered for her the night before and joined her hosts for breakfast. "I've been thinking," Frank said as he passed her a plate of eggs. "The Prescotts will be looking for you in town and on the main roads. It might be best if you stay here for a few days while I go into Silver Creek and speak with Sheriff Tanner." Katherine nodded reluctantly. "I suppose that's sensible, though I hate to impose on your hospitality any longer." "It's no imposition," Mrs. Wilkins assured her. "In fact, I'll be glad of the company. It gets lonely out here with just this taciturn cowboy for conversation." Frank smiled at the older woman's teasing. "I need to check on the north pasture anyway. The cattle should be moved to better grazing soon." After breakfast, Katherine insisted on helping with the dishes while Frank prepared to ride out. She watched through the window as he saddled his horse, admiring the efficient way he moved and the easy rapport he had with the animal. When he was ready to depart, Katherine stepped outside to see him off. "Please be careful, Mr. Jameson. The Prescotts won't have taken yesterday's defeat lightly." "I've dealt with their kind before," he assured her, "and please call me Frank. Then you must call me Katherine." Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary, and Katherine felt that same flutter in her chest she'd experienced the day before. Frank cleared his throat and mounted his horse. "I should be back by sundown," he said. "If I'm not, Mrs. Wilkins knows what to do." Katherine watched him ride away, a solitary figure against the vast landscape. Only when he disappeared over the ridge did she return to the cabin, where Mrs. Wilkins was watching her with knowing eyes. "That boy's been alone too long," the older woman commented as they set about their morning chores. "It does my heart good to see him look at a woman the way he looks at you." Katherine felt her cheeks warm. "We've only just met, Mrs. Wilkins." "Out here we don't have the luxury of long courtships like you might back east," Mrs. Wilkins replied. "Life is harder, shorter sometimes. When something good comes along, smart folks grab onto it with both hands." As the day progressed, Mrs. Wilkins shared more about Frank's history. He had come west as a young man of 19, fought briefly in the latter part of the Civil War, then returned to try his hand at ranching. His parents had both died of fever back in Pennsylvania, leaving him and his younger sister to make their own way. "He built this place up from nothing," Mrs. Wilkins said proudly as they hung laundry on the line. "Started with just 10 acres and 3 skinny cows. Now he's got nearly 100 head and 200 acres, not as big as the Prescott spread, but every bit of it earned honest." Katherine found herself increasingly intrigued by the quiet cowboy who had come to her rescue. By late afternoon, she was watching the ridge anxiously for his return. When the sun began to set with no sign of him, she couldn't hide her concern. "Should we be worried?" she asked Mrs. Wilkins as they prepared supper. The older woman's lips thinned. "Not yet, but if he's not back by full dark, we'll need to be prepared." She went to a cabinet and removed a shotgun, checking that it was loaded. "Do you know how to use one of these?" Katherine shook her head. "I never had occasion to learn." "Well, there's no time like the present." Mrs. Wilkins proceeded to give her a quick lesson in handling the weapon. "It's simple enough, point and pull the trigger, just be mindful of the kick." Just as darkness fell completely, they heard hoofbeats approaching. Mrs. Wilkins positioned herself by the window with the shotgun while Katherine peered anxiously into the gloom. "It's Frank," she said with relief as she recognized his silhouette, but as he came closer, she gasped. "He's hurt." They rushed outside to find Frank slumped in the saddle, his shirt darkened with blood. Between them, they managed to help him into the cabin and onto his bed. "Prescott men," he grunted as Mrs. Wilkins cut away his shirt to reveal a bullet wound in his left shoulder. Ambushed me on the way back from town. Did you see the sheriff? Katherine asked, trying to keep her voice steady as she helped Mrs. Wilkins clean the wound. Frank nodded grimly. Tanner's going to help, but Samuel Prescott is claiming you stole from him before running off. It's his word against ours for now. Mrs. Wilkins probed the wound with experienced fingers. Bullet went clean through. You're lucky, boy. Doesn't feel lucky, Frank muttered, wincing as the older woman began to bandage his shoulder. I'm so sorry, Katherine said, distressed. This is all because of me. Frank caught her hand with his good one. No, it's because the Prescotts think they're above the law. This was coming one way or another. His touch sent warmth spreading up Katherine's arm, and she found herself reluctant to pull away. Mrs. Wilkins noticed but said nothing, simply continuing her ministrations with a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. That night, Katherine took a turn sitting with Frank while Mrs. Wilkins got some rest. The wound had bled heavily, and Frank had developed a slight fever, though Mrs. Wilkins assured her it wasn't dangerous yet. In the dim light of a single lantern, Katherine bathed Frank's forehead with cool water. He drifted in and out of sleep, occasionally muttering things she couldn't quite make out. Once, he clearly said her name, and her heart gave a peculiar lurch. I'm here, she whispered, though she wasn't sure he could hear her. His eyes fluttered open, surprisingly clear despite the fever. You should go, he said hoarsely. In the morning, Mrs. Wilkins can take you to the stage station in Riverton. The Prescotts don't have as much influence there. I'm not leaving, Katherine replied firmly. Not while you're hurt because of me. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Stubborn woman. Yes, she agreed. Nearly as stubborn as a certain cowboy I recently met. Frank's hand found hers again, his grip weak but determined. I've only known you 2 days, Katherine Langston, but I think you might be the bravest person I've ever met. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of feelings developing far more rapidly than either of them might have expected. Katherine squeezed his hand gently. Rest now, she said softly. We'll figure everything out in the morning. The next few days fell into a pattern. Frank's fever broke and he began to regain his strength. Katherine and Mrs. Wilkins shared the tasks of caring for him and maintaining the ranch, with Katherine quickly learning skills she'd never imagined, needing how to milk a cow, collect eggs without antagonizing the hens, even how to shoot that shotgun with reasonable accuracy. You're a natural frontier woman, Mrs. Wilkins declared approvingly after Katherine successfully baked her first loaf of bread in the temperamental wood stove. Frank watched her adaptability with evident admiration. Most Eastern ladies would be complaining about the lack of comforts by now, he commented as she helped him walk around the cabin, his arm still in a sling. I'm finding I prefer this life to the one I left behind, Katherine admitted. There's an honesty to it that Boston society lacks. On the 4th day after the ambush, Sheriff Tanner rode up to the cabin. A tall, grizzled man with a magnificent mustache, he tipped his hat politely to Katherine before updating them on the situation in town. The Prescott story's falling apart, he reported as they sat around the table. One of the men who took you, Miss Langston, got drunk at the saloon and started bragging about the job. Several witnesses heard him. So Katherine can safely return to town, Frank asked. The sheriff stroked his mustache thoughtfully. I'd give it another week, let things cool down a bit more. The town council is standing behind your appointment as teacher, Miss Langston. They've made it clear to the Prescotts that their influence has limits. After the sheriff departed, promising to return in a few days with more news, Katherine found herself both relieved and strangely disappointed. Soon she would return to Silver Creek to begin her teaching position, which was what she had come west to do, but it would mean leaving the ranch, leaving Frank. That evening, as Mrs. Wilkins tactfully busied herself in her room with some mending, Katherine and Frank sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson. Beautiful, Katherine murmured. Yes, Frank agreed, though when she glanced over, he was looking at her, not the sunset. Katherine felt her cheeks warm. Frank, I know it's too soon, he interrupted gently. We've known each other less than a week, but I can't help feeling that there's something here worth exploring. He gestured between them. If you feel it too, that is. Katherine took a deep breath. I do feel it, and it terrifies me a little how quickly these feelings have developed. Frank's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. My father used to say that when lightning strikes, there's no use pretending it was just a gentle rain. Katherine laughed softly. My mother would be scandalized by how improper this all is. Is that a concern for you? Frank asked, his expression suddenly uncertain. Katherine considered the question seriously. She had been raised with strict ideas about proper courtship, formal introductions, chaperone visits, a suitable engagement period. Yet here she was, falling for a man she'd known less than a week, sitting unchaperoned with him as darkness fell. No, she finally said. I left those concerns behind when I came west. I want to live by my own judgment now, not by rules set by others. Frank's smile was like the sunrise. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned toward her. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question more than a declaration. When they parted, Katherine found herself breathless. Was that improper enough for you? Frank asked, his eyes twinkling. Katherine laughed. Barely. I think we might need to try again just to be sure. Their second kiss was less hesitant, a mutual exploration that left them both flushed and smiling foolishly at each other when Mrs. Wilkins called them in for supper. The next week passed in a sweet haze for Katherine. During the days, she helped around the ranch and continued her shooting lessons with Mrs. Wilkins. Frank regained his strength rapidly, soon able to resume most of his chores. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, talking for hours about their pasts, their hopes, their dreams for the future. I never planned to fall in love with a cowboy, Katherine confessed one night as they watched fireflies dance in the darkness. And I never planned to fall in love with a schoolteacher, Frank replied, his arm around her shoulders. Especially not one who attracts trouble like honey attracts bears. Katherine playfully swatted his chest. I do not attract trouble. Tell that to the Prescotts, he teased. Their laughter faded as they both acknowledged the reality they still faced. The Prescotts were temporarily subdued but not defeated. Soon Katherine would need to return to town to begin teaching, and the threat would resume. Sheriff Tanner returned as promised, bringing news that the town was eager for school to begin. The council's set up temporary lodgings for you with the pastor and his wife, he explained. Figured that would be safer than having you stay alone. Katherine nodded, though the thought of leaving the ranch, leaving Frank, filled her with an unexpected sadness. I'll ride in with her, Frank declared. Make sure she gets settled safely. The night before they were to depart for Silver Creek, Katherine found it impossible to sleep. After tossing and turning for hours, she gave up and went to sit on the porch. To her surprise, Frank was already there, staring up at the star-filled sky. Couldn't sleep either, he asked, making room for her on the bench. Katherine shook her head. I'm nervous about tomorrow, about leaving here. Frank was silent for a long moment. It doesn't have to be goodbye, he finally said. Silver Creek is only 10 miles away. I could ride in often. To visit the schoolteacher? Katherine asked, trying to keep her tone light. Frank turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. To court her properly if she'll allow it. Katherine's heart seemed to stop, then race ahead. Frank Jameson, are you asking to court me? I'm doing a poor job of it if you have to ask, he replied with a self-deprecating smile. Then he took her hands in his. Katherine Langston, in the short time I've known you, you've shown me courage, kindness, and a spirit that amazes me daily. I know it's fast, too fast by Eastern standards, but out here, life doesn't wait. I'd be honored if you'd allow me to court you formally, with the intention of asking for your hand if you find me worthy. Tears pricked Katherine's eyes. Yes, she whispered, I would like that very much. The next morning, they rode into Silver Creek together, Mrs. Wilkins following in a small wagon with Katherine's few belongings. The town seemed to hold its breath as they passed, curious faces watching from doorways and windows. The pastor and his wife welcomed Katherine warmly, assuring her that her room was ready and that they were delighted to have her stay until more permanent arrangements could be made. School starts on Monday, the pastor informed her. The children are quite excited to have a real teacher from the East. As Frank prepared to leave, he took Katherine aside for a moment of privacy. "I'll be back on Saturday," he promised. "Perhaps we could attend church together on Sunday," Katherine nodded, fighting back tears. It was ridiculous to be so emotional about a parting of only a few days, yet she couldn't help it. In the short time they'd known each other, Frank had become essential to her happiness. "Be careful," she urged. "The Prescotts will keep their distance if they're smart," Frank finished for her. He kissed her briefly, mindful of the pastor's presence nearby. Until Saturday. Katherine threw herself into preparing for school, grateful for the distraction. The one-room schoolhouse was simple but adequate, with new slates for the children and a small library of books donated by townspeople. By Monday morning, she felt ready to meet her pupils. 27 children of various ages filed into the schoolhouse that first day, their faces curious and a bit wary of the new teacher from back east. By lunchtime, Katherine had won over most of them with her genuine interest in their lives and her engaging teaching style. The week passed quickly. Katherine settled into a routine, teaching during the day and preparing lessons in the evenings. The pastor and his wife were kind, but allowed her the independence she valued. Several times, she caught glimpses of men she recognized as Prescott Ranch hands watching the schoolhouse, but they made no move to approach her. Saturday couldn't come quickly enough. When Frank rode into town, Katherine was waiting on the pastor's porch, her heart racing like a schoolgirl's. He looked wonderful, freshly shaved, wearing a clean shirt and his best hat. The way his face lit up when he saw her made Katherine feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. They spent the day together, walking through town, having lunch at the small hotel restaurant. Several townspeople greeted them warmly, though a few cast disapproving glances at their obvious attachment. "People are talking," Katherine noted as they strolled along the creek that gave the town its name. "Let them," Frank replied, unconcerned. "In a place this small, they'd talk no matter what we did." That evening, Frank joined Katherine and her hosts for dinner. The pastor, observing their affection for each other, commented, "You two seem quite devoted for such a new acquaintance." "Sometimes the heart recognizes what the mind would take longer to discover," Frank replied, his eyes meeting Katherine's across the table. On Sunday, they attended church together, ignoring the whispers their paired arrival generated. Katherine held her head high, remembering Mrs. Wilkins's words about not having the luxury of long courtships in the West. As they left the church, a commotion arose at the far end of the street. 3 riders approached at a gallop, and Katherine's blood ran cold as she recognized Samuel Prescott in the lead. "Get inside," Frank urged, trying to steer her back toward the church, but Katherine stood her ground. "No, I'm done running from bullies." The Prescott brothers Samuel, William, and Jacob dismounted a few yards away. Samuel, the eldest, stepped forward, tall and well-dressed. He might have been handsome if not for the cruelty in his eyes. "Miss Langston," he said, tipping his hat with mock politeness. "I see you've aligned yourself with Jameson here. Not a wise choice for a lady hoping to maintain a respectable position in our community." "I believe Miss Langston can choose her own associates," Frank replied evenly, though Katherine could feel the tension in him. By now, a crowd had gathered, including Sheriff Tanner, who moved to stand nearby, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Samuel Prescott's eyes narrowed. "This isn't over, Jameson. Silver Creek isn't big enough for both of us." "Funny," Frank replied. "I've always found it plenty big enough." "Perhaps the problem isn't the size of the town, but the size of your ego." A murmur of appreciation ran through the crowd. Samuel's face darkened with anger, but with the sheriff watching closely, he merely tipped his hat again. "Miss Langston, when you tire of playing pioneer with this." "Cowboy, my offer remains open." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "A woman of your background deserves better than a dirt-poor rancher." Katherine stepped forward, her chin high. "Mr. Prescott, let me be perfectly clear. I would sooner marry a rattlesnake than accept any offer from you." "Now, if you'll excuse us, you're interrupting a lovely Sunday." For a moment, Samuel looked as though he might strike her. Then, with a forced laugh, he turned away. "Come on, boys, the schoolmarm's not worth our time." As the Prescotts rode away, the tension in the air dissipated. Several townspeople approached to express their support for Katherine and Frank. "Don't you worry about those Prescott boys," the blacksmith's wife assured Katherine. "Their influence is waning. Too many folks are tired of their bullying ways." That evening, as Frank prepared to return to his ranch, he took Katherine's hands in his. "You were magnificent today," he said softly. "I've never seen Samuel Prescott speechless before." Katherine smiled, though her heart was heavy at their parting. "Will you come next Saturday?" "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," Frank promised. "And perhaps you could ride out to the ranch for Sunday dinner. Mrs. Wilkins misses you terribly." "I'd like that very much," Katherine replied. The pattern was established. Each Saturday, Frank would come to town, and on Sundays, Katherine would ride to the ranch with him, returning in the evening. Their courtship progressed steadily, each visit deepening their understanding and appreciation of one another. 3 months after Katherine began teaching, Frank rode into town on a Wednesday, surprising her as she dismissed her pupils for the day. "Is something wrong?" she asked, concerned by his unexpected appearance. Frank shook his head, taking her hands in his. "Nothing's wrong. In fact, everything's right." He drew a deep breath. "I couldn't wait until Saturday." Before Katherine realized what was happening, Frank was down on one knee before her, heedless of the children watching wide-eyed from the schoolyard. "Katherine Langston, I knew from the moment I lifted you from the dust that you were someone special. These past months have only confirmed what my heart already knew, that you are the woman I want to spend my life with." He reached into his pocket and produced a small ring with a modest pearl. "It was my mother's. Will you marry me?" Katherine's vision blurred with tears of joy. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "yes." Frank slipped the ring onto her finger and stood, gathering her into his arms for a kiss that set the schoolchildren to giggling and cheering. They were married 2 weeks later in the Silver Creek Church, with Mrs. Wilkins beaming proudly from the front pew. The entire town turned out for the celebration, with the notable exception of the Prescott family. "Their loss," Frank commented as they danced at their wedding celebration in the town hall. "Though I hear they're having troubles of their own. Seems Samuel overextended himself trying to buy up more land. They might be forced to sell part of their holdings." Katherine smiled, content in her husband's arms. "I can't find it in my heart to feel sorry for them." "That's my girl," Frank murmured, pulling her closer. "Beautiful and fierce." As they rode back to the ranch that evening, now their ranch, Katherine reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. From being thrown into the dust by strangers to finding love with the cowboy who had rescued her, her journey had been unexpected but perfect in its way. "Happy?" Frank asked as they approached the cabin, which Mrs. Wilkins had decorated with wildflowers for their return. Katherine looked at her husband, her heart full to bursting. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible." Frank lifted her from the saddle and carried her across the threshold of their home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Jameson," he whispered against her lips. "Home," Katherine repeated, the word sweeter than she'd ever known it could be. "I like the sound of that." 1 year later, Katherine stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching Frank ride in from checking the herd. Their ranch had prospered, growing to include several hired hands and twice as many cattle. The Prescotts had indeed been forced to sell much of their land, their influence in the area significantly diminished. Katherine continued to teach at the Silver Creek School, though she now had an assistant to help on days when ranch duties called her home early. The townspeople had fully embraced her as one of their own, and many of her Eastern educational ideas had been implemented with great success. As Frank dismounted and approached, Katherine placed a hand on her slightly rounded belly. They had only confirmed the pregnancy the week before, and the joy of impending parenthood still felt new and wondrous. "How are my 2 favorite people today?" Frank asked, kissing her tenderly. "We're perfect," Katherine replied, leaning into his embrace. "Just perfect." She thought back to that fateful day when strangers had thrown her into the dust and a cowboy had lifted her up. What had seemed like the worst moment of her life had led to the best decision she'd ever made. "What are you thinking about?" Frank asked, noting her thoughtful expression. Katherine smiled up at him, her heart full of love and gratitude. Just that sometimes the worst moments can lead us to the best places if we're brave enough to follow where they lead. Frank's arms tightened around her. "And thank God you were brave enough, Katherine Jameson." As the sun set over their land, painting the world in gold and promise, Katherine knew with absolute certainty that this was where she belonged, not in a Boston parlor or even a Silver Creek schoolhouse, but here, in the arms of her cowboy, building a life and a legacy together in the wild, beautiful West.